October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. I've heard that phrase over and over and over again, mostly from the pro-Hamas camp, who somehow tries to justify what happened, what took place on that morning. No, they say, you can't only look at the attack. You have to walk back 75 years to the birth of the modern state of Israel if you want to understand. Now, in a sense, I agree with their original statement. October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. But that's where my agreement ends. Because you cannot walk back 75 years. Because that means equating the rebirth of the modern state of Israel to the birth of Israel. If you want to understand the complexities, the context, the history, the role players of October 7th and the ensuing war, we need to walk back 3.5 thousand years to biblical times and then trace history back to present day. It's a complex undertaking, of course. It takes us back 3.5 thousand years to biblical times. It looks at archaeology. It looks at historical records. But without that, without taking the time, we are, in fact, simply looking at October 7th and the ensuing war in a vacuum. So, here today to help us unpack that complex history, to put it in perspective for us, is Dr. Jonathan Spyer. Jonathan, welcome. Let me introduce you. Jonathan is an analyst, author, and journalist specializing in Middle East affairs. He was born in Britain and holds a master's degree in Middle East politics and a PhD in international relations. He moved to Israel in the early 90s and served in the IDF, and he's a combat veteran of the Second Lebanon War. Now, he's the director of research at the Middle East Forum. He's a research fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Strategy and Security. He's a columnist for the Jerusalem Post, with his pieces featured regularly in the Wall Street Journal, the Australian, Jane's Intelligence Review, Foreign Policy, and so forth. He's an author, he's a speaker. The list goes on, and then it goes on some more. Now, Jonathan has covered the Syrian and the Iraq wars in detail. He's also covered the war in Ukraine and most recently the war in Gaza, which for Jonathan entails spending time in these war-torn areas, getting to know the people, hiding with them in bomb shelters, and ultimately telling their stories. And that's one of the things I admire tremendously about Jonathan, his ability to bring that human element, the heart of the story. Now, the other thing I admire tremendously about Jonathan is his ability to unpack complex, tangled, protracted issues in a way that enables you not only to grasp the pertinent points, but also the context. So, who better than Jonathan to help us untangle the history of 3,500 years? Jonathan, mic's all yours. Let's jump right in. Like I said, October 7th, the anti-Israel lobby said 75 years. However, I think we need to go back a few thousand years. And when we think of history in Israel, in the Promised Land, we think of the Bible. We have the Bible, the Jewish people have the Tanakh. What other proof do we have of a Jewish presence, of King David in Jerusalem?
Well, as far as I'm aware, at least, with regard to the very early history you're talking about, the Davidic kingdom and the arrival of King David up from Hebron to Jerusalem. Then, of course, going back, if you go further back into the Bible, obviously, in terms of Jacob and the 12 tribes and so on, you know, much of this, actually, the sources that we do have are, in fact, the Tanakh itself, and not a great deal else. Once you get a little bit forward from that, in terms of the United Kingdom of Israel, you know, the Kingdom of Israel in the north and of Judea in the south, and then the destruction of Kingdom of Israel by Assyria, or Ashur as we call it in Hebrew, and then the later destruction of Judah by Babylon and the Babylonian exile, and then the return from exile as a result of King Cyrus's intervention. As the time goes forward, then you begin to find that there is increasing elements of archaeological evidence alongside the biblical narrative. Once you move a bit forward from there and you start to reach the period of, let us say, 300-400 BCE, then the evidence becomes much more concrete. In other words, with regard to the presence of the Second Temple, of course, and of the Hasmonean kingdom, the Hashmonaim, and the Hasmonean rebellion against the Seleucid Greeks, and then the emergence of Rome and to domination in this area coming up from Egypt. Then, you have multiple historical sources to confirm that. So, for example, with regard to the presence of the Second Temple, then there is clear historical examples such as the Roman historian Pliny the Elder and many others, and of course, famously Flavius Josephus in the Jewish War and his other writings. So then we're out of the realm of semi-mythical, we can say, history, or it's not necessarily mythical, but history which takes us back into the distance of the distant mists of time, so to speak. And we're already into the era where you have historians, you have written record, you have art, you have artifacts, you have archaeological ruins to depend on. And in terms of once we're into that period of Hashmonaim and onwards, of course taking in then the very dramatic period of the Jewish revolt against Rome, or the revolts against Rome, the destruction of the temple in AD or CE 70, and then of course the final major Jewish revolt in the 2nd century CE of Shimon Bar Kokhba, and then the destruction of Bar Kokhba's revolt at very, very great cost to the Jewish people in year 135. This is all. There are multiple sources for that. You're no longer anymore relying just on a single text of a single people. So I think that's the point. As one reaches closer, out of antiquity, then predictably, I guess, the records become more concrete and more multiple.
So well documented, if we look in more modern history, and archaeology. We have multiple finds on that. Now, what I want us to focus on in more ancient history is the ancient Philistines. There's often the claim that there's a link between the ancient Philistines and the Palestinians of today. So can you give us just a rundown of the history of the ancient Philistines?
Well, regarding the Philistines, there is very little which is known, because once again, most of the evidence comes actually from the Jewish account, i.e. in the Tanakh, where this people is presented as having been a very serious antagonist to the people of Israel. So what do we know, or what do we think about the Philistines? The Philistines, we think that this is a Greek of origin, seafaring people that managed to establish themselves from across the Mediterranean to establish a kind of foothold along the coastline of what is today Israel, and of course what is today also the Gaza Strip, and which then entered into a long period of antagonism and warfare with the people of Israel before sort of fairly abruptly vanishing from the pages of history. Let's say there is nothing remotely resembling any continuum on any conceivable level between this ancient people, of whom we only know of because of their presence in Jewish texts, and the modern Arab Muslim, or overwhelmingly Muslim Arab people who today choose to call themselves Palestinians. On the contrary, the word Palestine for this area comes from Western usage. You can find it also going quite a way back to some ancient Greek writers who refer. There was never a state of Palestine, but they refer to this area as Palestine. It's not a word which comes from the local people or from the Arabs. It comes from the Greeks. Yeah, which is why, if we think of how did it come about that this area, for a short period of time in the 20th century, once again found itself being called Palestine, it was because from the Greeks, Westerners and Western Christianity chose to refer to this area often as Palestine. So when the British reconstituted themselves as the dominant force there after the collapse of Ottoman Empire in 1917, 1918, they sort of fished down into their own historical texts and records and decided to recreate what they thought of as the area once known as Palestine. Now, by almost a kind of paradoxical process, this name was then in modern times, in 19th and 20th century, adopted by certain Arab nationalists to refer to the area. They famously had to, in fact, a little bit corrupt the original word because Arabic does not have the letter P, so they chose to call it Philistine. which is what it's called today. But it's a word of Western origin, not of Arabic origin or local origin. Goodness. And then, from then on, from the 1950s and 60s onwards, we have the birth of a very specific Arab nationalism, referring to itself as Palestinian nationalism. So this is a very potted history, of course, of the term. But what we can conclude, I think, not with some confidence, frankly, with overwhelming certainty, is that there is absolutely no historical link between this mysterious Greek seafaring people of antiquity, called in Hebrew texts or Jewish texts as the Philistines, and the modern people that call themselves Arab people, Muslim people that call themselves Palestinians. By the way, the Palestinians themselves also, in more recent terminology, rarely make this connection. When they try to make a biblical connection nowadays, at one time they did refer to the Philistines, but more recently, now when they try to make a biblical connection for themselves, the people they like to compare themselves to are the Canaanites rather than the Philistines, because what they say is, well, they are the descendants of the people who were in the land even when Yeshua bin Nun, came into the country to conquer it for the people of Israel. In other words, they want to try to create a claim of primacy even before ancient Israel, so to speak. But this also is equally fanciful, but this tends to be the claim which they make nowadays, rather than the link. And of course there is an etymological link because of the two names, but they tend nowadays not to try to maintain or assert a historic link to Philistines. If they talk about antiquity at all, and they do quite a bit, they try to claim that they're connected to the Canaanites, with equally little civilizational or religious or linguistic justification. The justification which they can make, or at least which is harder to deny on the face of it, because anybody can claim what they like in this regard, is they say, well, we are the kind of direct DNA descendants of the Canaanites. The fact that we have a different language and different religion to them is because invaders came in from elsewhere and sort of forced us to, or caused us to adopt this or that religious philosophy. But if you look at the DNA, then we are direct descendants of the Canaanites. Now, DNA is an emerging science to some degree, so one can make all kinds of claims. But this is the kind of claim, when it's made, which is made. It's a claim nowadays made to indigeneity, as they like to assert it.
Goodness. So, okay. We have spoken about the link between the ancient Philistines and also then the ancient Canaanites and the Palestinians of today. But if we go back to, say, for instance, where did the name originate? We spoke about Greek, but this came about after the fall of the Second Temple, correct? The name.
Oh, I see. Yes, when the country, when an actual administrative unit emerged as Palestine. Yeah, this was actually after the Bar Kokhba revolt, I believe, when the name was renamed, when the country was renamed from the province of Judea, of course, to be called Syria Palestina. By the Roman authorities. I would need to check it, because it may have been after the AD 70. It was after either then or Bar Kokhba revolt. But after the period of Jewish revolts, I think it was after Bar Kokhba was crushed, then the Romans wanted quite categorically to sort of cut the link between the people of Israel and the land. So they introduced this new administrative term, Syria Palestina. But it's worth remembering that, once the Romans are gone, once we have Muslim conquest of the country, and then the long period of Ottoman, of Turkish and then Ottoman rule of the country, there was no such thing as an administrative unit called Palestine. The Turks had nothing like that.
So let's go back to that. The Arab conquest as actually colonizers of this area.
Yeah, sure. Well, absolutely. I mean, the Arabs are, it's kind of quite paradoxical or interesting, because today, of course, there is in the West, a kind of dominant, I would say, language or discourse in which colonization and conquest are regarded as negative things. And if your ancestors were engaged in anything like that, you're supposed to sort of hang your head in shame and be very much ashamed of it. Of course, in the Arab world, there's nothing parallel to that. The Arabs, and indeed, actually, by the way, most other peoples in the world, are extremely proud of their conquering ancestors, who they regard as, great people who sort of carried their banner with victory and success into other parts of the world. That, to some degree, that is all of human history, first of all. And most people, most of the time, see no reason to be ashamed of it. The Arabs, likewise, are very proud, when they're speaking Arabic among themselves, of their own history as conquerors and victors. They're aware, I think, that in the West there is this language of where victimhood is regarded as the greatest aspiration. So when they're speaking English, they're quite prepared or quite happy to talk about themselves as victims. When they're talking about themselves, they're very proud of themselves, not as victims at all. They despise and look down at victims. They're proud of themselves as colonizers and victors. As a part of that, one of the most important illustrious episodes or periods of Arab history from the mainstream point of view would be that period after the death of, or during the life of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, and then after it, in which Muslim armies erupted out of the Arabian Peninsula, what is today Saudi Arabia and that area, and conquered large swathes of land to the east and west of that area. And one of the episodes of Muslim conquest was the victorious Muslim armies that reached the Mediterranean Sea and that therefore conquered what is today the land of Israel or Israel. So yes, the entry of Omar ibn al-Khattab to Jerusalem is regarded as a very great victory. And then the loss of Jerusalem and then the subsequent reconquest of it, or loss of the land of Israel, part of it at least, and then subsequent reconquest of it from the European Crusaders 400, 500, 600 years later, after that, is also a period of great pride for Arabs and Muslims. Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, is a great hero of the Arabs and Muslims. Salah ad-Din was himself, in fact, not an Arab. He was, in fact, of Kurdish ethnicity, but that tends to be less stressed in Arab accounts. Yeah, but certainly as a great Muslim, warrior leader, he's regarded with great respect and regard. So yes, the answer is there was Muslim, of course. Islam came across the Middle East and came to Jerusalem and to the land of Israel on the backs of or on the horses of conquering armies. That's how Islam came to this part of the world. That is how the Arabic language came to be the lingua franca in this part of the world as a result of conquest. Absolutely.
So then we move on to the Ottoman Empire and basically ruling over this entire area for hundreds of years, ending with World War I. And what happens after World War I? Because this entire area, after the Ottomans lose, is thrown into a disarray.
Yes, well, after the Ottoman Empire collapses following the defeat of Ottomans of course, the Ottomans were on what was called the Central Powers, that's on the German side in World War I. So they were defeated by the British and French in this area. A number of things transpire. One is that the Turks wage a kind of successful war of independence against the British and French, whereby they managed to preserve what is today the Republic of Turkey. They kind of carve out a sort of truncated area of the former Ottoman Empire, which then becomes Turkey. But more broadly, the areas in the Middle East of the former Ottoman Empire are divided up famously between the British and the French, who form in this area, in what is called the Levant, mandatory authorities, which are not supposed to be open colonies. They're supposed to be sort of administrations which are supposed to be guiding the people in the area towards eventual independence. And in this area of the Levant, let's say in the land of Israel and what is today Jordan, the British are the authority. They're also the authority in Iraq. And then in the northern tier of the Levant, what is today Syria and Lebanon, the French are the colonial or mandatory authority. So what happens is that the formerly Ottoman lands of the Middle East are divided firstly between the British and French, and then subdivided into further by them into administrative authorities that later on become the states with which we are today familiar, as Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel and the Palestinian territories.
It's a mess. It's a mess. It's no wonder we see so much conflict in this area.
Well, yeah, it's the kind of mess which happens when empires fall. I mean, usually when the pattern when empires fall, which we can trace other examples in modernity, is that the area in question is subdivided, is subsequently divided into successor states. We can see that happened, for example, with the fall of the Soviet Union, which of course was an empire in all but name, and we can think of all the new states that have formed, obviously Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and various other states, including the Russian Federation, which is itself a successor state to Soviet Union. And we can think of other examples, the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well. And history is replete with examples of this kind. Usually what happens more or less, is that after a period of conflict, the states sort themselves out into successor entities, which then manage more or less to coexist. That's mostly what history shows us. Here in the Middle East, to some degree, that is the case as well, but there are notable exceptions, and Israel, the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel, is a notable exception. In my conception, or in my view of these things, Israel is not unique in this regard. I think that we can trace the following pattern. Everywhere in the Arabic-speaking Middle East, or the area in which Arabic speakers are the majority, Arabic-speaking Muslims are the majority, attempts made by other communities, minority communities or remnants of colonial settlers, to establish polities of their own, are met with attempts at politicide, attempts at quickly destroying those entities, usually successfully. And in fact, more or less uniquely, the one entity established in this case by a regional minority, not by a group of colonial settlers, the regional minority being the Jews, is the State of Israel. The one exception which has managed to both get to sovereignty and successfully defend its sovereignty is Israel. If we think of other examples where I could say that people have tried and failed, the French settlers in Algeria, the Pieds Noirs, are an example of a group of colonial settlers who tried to establish something approaching political continuity, and they were destroyed, of course, by the Algerian Revolution. The Lebanese Christians, an indigenous minority, of course, sought to establish a polity which they dominated in modern state of Lebanon. They failed, and that was destroyed, and they are today a largely broken community. Kurdish speakers, again, or Kurds, again, a local indigenous minority, have tried on two occasions in the Arab world, one in northern Iraq, one in northern Syria, to reach something approaching sovereignty. Both those entities still exist in northern Syria and northern Iraq, but they're weak and they're much below the achievement of sovereignty. So the one exception in which, in this case, a regional minority, the Jews, have managed to create full sovereignty and successfully defend it against the attempts by Arab Muslims to destroy it is the State of Israel. In this respect, it's quite unique. But in a way, what's more unique is not just Israel itself. What's more unique is the apparent need or desire of the Arab Muslim population not to accept the right of anybody other than themselves to establish sovereignty in the area that they regard as their natural place of primacy. And this is a phenomenon which we deal with again and again. And I would say that the fight, the Islamic or Islamist fight against Israel, to destroy Israel, is one manifestation of this tendency. But I would say that, for example, the emergence of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, a decade and a half ago, and then the attempt by that Islamic State to commit acts of genocide against non-Arab and non-Muslim minorities in Iraq and Syria, is another manifestation of the same impulse. It is this impulse ultimately, in my estimation, which is the cause of continued conflict in this region. It is this impulse ultimately which prevents the Middle East from going down the usual road of post-imperial spaces that we were discussing a few minutes ago, in which, yes, the empire collapses, you have a period of strife as new entities emerge and conflict with one another, but after a limited period of time, the entities solidify, the borders solidify, and something approaching peaceful relations emerges. That's happened more or less everywhere else, with huge blips, of course, but in the Middle East, when it comes to the issue of minorities seeking sovereignty, that hasn't happened at all. The trend of the Arab Muslim side to seek to destroy those entities in a way sort of trumps over that tendency and ensures that continued strife and warfare are everybody's lot.
The production of this investigative series is made possible by the generous donations of Christians from around the world. You can also make a difference by supporting this initiative. We want you to share, to give, and be a voice so that we can produce more series like this. The truth about what is happening here in Israel and around the world must be told, and it must go out. Please click on the link to donate.
Now, Jonathan, what I hear very often is people say, oh, Israel was only established 75 years ago. But from what I gather, so was Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, basically around the same time frame, correct?
Absolutely.
And then the other accusation is that there was a thriving Palestinian community with leaders, with a separate language, right here in Israel. And the Jews came from Europe following the Second World War and displaced and colonized. So how do we answer that?
Well, I mean, I just think that's a very simplistic picture for the following reasons. We've already discussed a little bit the obviously ancient Jewish presence and the presence of ancient Jewish sovereign polities in this part of the world, or in this country, which the period of which came to an end, as we discussed, with the crushing of Bar Kokhba revolt by the Romans in the 2nd century. But the fact is that Jewish population here did not end in the 2nd century. In a way, even contrary to Jewish myth, it's not the case that the entire population after Bar Kokhba was exiled. Many were exiled, many were killed, but not all. So the subsequent centuries are ones in which you have a constant ebb and flow of Jewish presence, but also of presence of other related minorities, such as the Shomronim, or Samaritan people of Samaria, who are closely related to the Jews, and other indigenous minorities, rising in population, declining in population, the Arab Muslims coming in. As a culture, at least, we discussed earlier that there are those who claim, yes, but demographically there were others who became Arabized or Islamized. This we can discuss, but we can say with certainty the Islam and Arabic as a culture came in the 7th century, and there was a subsequent interaction between these various cultures, up and down. So I think we can what we can trace, and we have the figures, is basically from the 18th century onwards. By the way, quite a long time before the usual time when modern Zionism, Jewish nationalism, is dated as beginning. But from the 18th century onwards, we can begin to trace a slow return of Jewish population, bolstering the small existing Jewish population that was already there. And this is not surprising, of course, because the notion of return to the land of Israel is woven into Jewish culture, Jewish religious practice, Jewish literature. If you look at the Jewish grace after meals, the thing which Jews say maybe 3 times a day, the grace after meals asks, for the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the return of the Jews to the land of Israel. So this is a constant motif and a element in Jewish culture. There was always a Jewish presence here. What you have is then you have the slow build-up from a sort of just inchoate return and build-up of an existing population, to then the birth of a cultural and linguistic nationalism, to then the birth of a political nationalism and a desire for independence. This is the very traceable process of rebirth and re-establishment of Jewish presence in the country. Parallel to that, not only here, but also in what is now Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, you have the emergence, again, on the post-Ottoman, on the ruins of Ottoman Empire, of Arab, even maybe a parallel process of Arab linguistic and cultural and then political nationalism. Arab nationalism wishes to turn the entire Arabic-speaking world into a single strong Arab state. So it's a natural process in which these two projects collide. Both of them are trying to establish themselves on the former Ottoman territory. The Jewish one is much more modest because the Jews are much smaller people. It just wants one small country. The Arab project wants the entirety of the Arabic-speaking world, but it wants to include that space as well. So you have a clash between the two. The notion, and by the way, I don't wish to in any way belittle or dismiss the depth of Arab and Islamic political and religious sentiment in this part of the world. They've been around for more than a millennium. They're very authentic. When it comes to the notion of a separate Palestinian people and Palestinian history, this does seem to me to be, well, it's of much more recent vintage, and I think it's a rather more flimsy, frankly, intellectual and historical construct than Arab and Islamic identity, which are very real and have been around it for a while and are very authentic. This Palestinian idea is a much newer thing. It only really has any coherent existence, actually, as a kind of response to Zionism, a response to Jewish re-establishment in the country. So to a great extent we can say that Palestinian nationalism is kind of the Arab-Muslim reaction in the local context to the Jewish re-establishment and return of strength and eventually sovereignty to the area in question. So that's what I'd say. So the idea that there was coexistent to Zionism and to Jewish nationalism in the 18th and 19th century, a parallel, local, strong, crystallized, developed Palestinian leadership calling itself Palestinian and arguing and thriving and arguing for Palestinian political independence is a construct. It's a falsehood, frankly. But and it comes much later. And you can start to trace these claims essentially from the 1960s and not a great deal of time before. But when it comes to the much more authentic and rooted project of, I would say, the desire for Arab sovereignty and Islamic assertiveness, this is a genuine local project going back centuries, and it is a natural and just, I would say just, in my view, it doesn't have justice on its side, but natural and understandable project that in the aftermath of Ottoman collapse, Arabs should wish to assert themselves, their culture, their religion. Unfortunately, reality being as it is, this project was set from the very beginning on a collision course with the Jewish project.
Right.
Only one could win. Israel has won. In the usual state of affairs, what we would then have is a gradual reconciliation by the populations in question to a reality in place. For the reasons we discussed earlier, that reconciliation has not taken place here, and so we have a continued conflict.
Now, if we move towards October 7th, our focus needs to shift to Gaza.
Yeah.
Which kind of happens or starts to emerge after the War of Independence in 1948. What happened with the ceasefire lines? Because what we have is often people saying, oh, a two-state solution. It's hailed as the absolute answer to the whole Middle Eastern crisis. However, that two-state solution seems to me it was already on the table with the UN Partition plan. And again, when Gaza was handed over to the Palestinian Authority. But let's go back to the UN Partition plan.
Well, the UN Partition plan of 1947, Resolution 181, envisages, yes, you're correct, it doesn't call it a Palestinian state because, again, as we discussed earlier, that term was not in wide usage to describe the Arab population here in the 1940s. But the 181 describes or envisages the establishment of a Jewish state and an Arab state. That's what it calls it, west of the Jordan River. And it has certain borders demarcated for that state, which, by the way, were rather more advantageous to the Arab side than what is currently on offer. However, the Arab side rejected the plan. The Jewish side accepted it. This, I think, relates to what we were saying a moment ago with regard to the overwhelming determination not only of the Arabs who call themselves Palestinians today, but more broadly of the Arab Muslim side in this neighborhood, to prevent the imperative from their point of view, to prevent the emergence of non-Arab or non-Muslim polities in this area. We witness this, as we said, also in Syria and in Iraq and elsewhere. And the local manifestation of it here is the absolute rejection of the partition plan, the emergence of intercommunal warfare in the months following that rejection, and then the intervention of 5 Arab armies invited in by the local Arab leadership in order to crush the nascent Jewish state in its cradle, so to speak. Famously, this attempt failed in 1948. What the current thing which we call the Gaza Strip is, in terms of its dimensions, is simply the product of the ceasefire lines, the armistice lines of 1949. That's to say, the Gaza Strip is simply as far as the Egyptian armies got before they were stopped by the nascent, emergent Israeli forces. That's what it is. So Gaza Strip is the product of ceasefire lines. By the way, this is not in any way to belittle it. Lots and lots of national state borders are the result of ceasefire lines too. But that's what we would think about if we're talking about the birth of the Gaza Strip. It's an emergence of the point to which rival armies exhausted one another and then reached a ceasefire. In 49.
So we have, in 49, we have the Egyptian army coming into where the border is with Gaza, and then Israel on the other side. Now, that was that way until 1967,
yes.
The Six-Day War.
Correct.
What happened then?
Well, then what happened was that war broke, another episode of war. There was an intervening episode again, which was in 1956, of war between Israel and Egypt. But in 1967, Israel, as a result of war between Israel and then Jamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt, or then it wasn't even called Egypt, it was called United Arab Republic, because they'd sought to unite with Syria at that time. Failed, of course, to do so, but called themselves United Arab Republic nevertheless anyway. Israel, of course, defeated their forces and as a result came into possession of the Gaza Strip and indeed, of course, of Judea and Samaria, or what's called the West Bank, which was conquered from the Jordanians, and indeed the Golan Heights, which was conquered from the Syrians, all in the course of the same short war.
6 days, my goodness.
In 6 days, yeah. It's interesting to note, even prior to discussing that, that, of course, Gaza Strip, as it was possessed by the Egyptians from 49 until 67. Interestingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, was there a call or a campaign by the Palestinian people of Gaza Strip for independence from Egypt at that time? Nothing. We cannot trace any example of anything like that, which is kind of interesting given that we were told a moment ago that there was this pre-existing, very deeply rooted, self-identifying Palestinian leadership in what was called Palestine. So if this is the case and such a leadership existed, why is it that it appeared to acquiesce so readily to Egyptian rule in Gaza Strip or Jordanian rule in the West Bank? And the answer is, of course, without wishing to sound facetious, but the answer is, of course, that this supposedly deeply rooted local leadership only seems to really emerge in opposition to non-Muslim and non-Arab rule in the area, that is to say, Jewish rule. When you have that rule, all of a sudden this pre-existing, deeply rooted local leadership emerges. But when you have the areas in question being ruled by other Arabs and other Muslims, apparently this deeply rooted local leadership loses all its nascent desire for independent political sovereignty for itself.
So the Palestinian national drive basically only picks up after 67, when there's Jewish rule.
Well, yes, the PLO, it's a little bit more nuanced than that in the following. Basically, that's right. But in terms of the historical record is an interesting one. The PLO is actually, Palestine Liberation Organization, is actually established 3 years prior to 67, in 1964, and it is established by the Egyptians. And the intention is that it will be an Egyptian-supported organization that will seek to help to destroy Israel. So, yeah, the original PLO is only really born as a kind of puppet, actually, of the Egyptian, of the regime in Cairo. Then, after 67, you start to see the real emergence and emergence to prominence and notability of an independent Palestinian military, paramilitary, and terrorist and political military effort. The Fatah movement, by the way, Arafat's movement, is founded in the late 1950s, but it only really becomes a consequential movement after 1967. Now, why is that? I would suggest it is the following reason. 67 was in many ways the nadir, the destruction of the general Arab military effort to destroy Israel. Once that's failed, and fail it did in 67, you start to find attempts at new forms of political and military organization with the same goal in mind, the goal being to destroy the non-Arab and non-Muslim state that's been established west of the Jordan River. But new methods, instead of conventional military methods, political and paramilitary and guerrilla and terrorist efforts. And the Palestinian movement is born in that climate, which comes about after 1967, reaches its heyday in the 70s and 80s, and then gives way, I would say, to Islamic or Islamist forms of political and military organization, which have dominated ever since and which continue to dominate today.
What I also find interesting is that prior to 67, between 49 and 67, no call for Palestinian statehood by the Palestinian people, but also we get it from Egypt, from everywhere around the world. However, Egypt never offered to create a Palestinian state in Gaza, correct?
Absolutely, yeah, of course. Oh, not of course, but yeah, of course. This is the reality, because once again, the notion of a separate Palestinian nationality was not really around then. I mean, it's something which came about and began to be accepted, even by the population themselves from the 60s and 70s onwards, not really before that. I mean, if you'd said to most of the Arabs here in the 1940s, you're Palestinians, many of them wouldn't have known what you were talking about. And some of them who did know what you were talking about would have indignantly rejected that and said, no, you're trying to divide the Arabic people up into lots of little units in order to weaken them. We're not going to buy into that. Actually, we are an Arab people, or in another version, we are part of a larger Syrian nation, and Palestine, as you call it, is actually part of southern Syria. So there are various versions, but yeah, absolutely, this notion of a separate Palestinian identity seeking self-determination is demonstrably of very recent historical vintage.
How did we get from the 1960s to 60 years later, and it is front and center on every agenda? It didn't
Yeah.
exist in the 1950s, and all of a sudden, it's the most important thing in the world.
I think there are two things to bear in mind with this. One is that other Arab identities, Arab state identities, I mean, are of relatively recent historical vintage. So in the same way that you can, many of them, not all of them, but in this part of the Middle East at least, if we think about Syrian identity or Iraqi identity, these are also problematic identities that to some degree are the product of modernity and to some degree can be called into question. I mean, when we saw in the Syrian civil war just a few years ago, and then in the ISIS war that followed it in Iraq and in Syria, what we witnessed was, to a great extent, the kind of collapse of those identities into their component parts, with so-called Syrians of Kurdish ethnicity asserting themselves, with Sunni Syrians and Iraqis asserting themselves in the name of Sunni Islam rather than Iraqi or Syrian identity. So all these identities are a little bit new, are a little bit of somewhat recent vintage. So this is one of the reasons why it's not maybe entirely surprising that an identity called Palestinian identity can be of relatively recent vintage and nevertheless can be, felt subjectively, very passionately and sincerely by some of the people who consider themselves part of it. This is firstly with regard to the emergence of Palestinian and flourishing, apparently, of Palestinian identity. However, of course, the world, as you mentioned correctly,
Indeed.
is not equally incensed by, let us say, the issue of Sunni Arabs in Syria or Kurds or Yazidis or whatever else. On the contrary, the world is largely indifferent to much of that, except when it's forced upon it. So here we must seek the explanation, I think, not with regard to in modern Arab political identities, but rather with regard to modern and not modern and ancient fixations on the issue of the Jews. And the particular place of the Jews, I would say, in both Western Christian and also Muslim views of the world, each in their different way, places the Jew on a certain level of importance. Obviously, the Jews and the Jewish story and Jewish history in some ways lies at the very center of Western cultural and political consciousness, or it's one of the stories that helps to shape the West. And of course, that can manifest itself sometimes in benevolent ways, but much of it has been malevolent throughout Jewish history. That's to say that much of the Western world, has grown up with a kind of very deep fury and hatred at the Jewish people. And this, as it turns out, it doesn't take much to activate and revive that. And secondly, with regard to the Muslim world, and I would argue that in the West today, in Britain or France or elsewhere, it is Muslim anti-Jewish feeling which is the spark which is reviving anti-Semitism. It's not only Muslims who are then taking part in fanning the subsequent flames, but it is the Muslim world which is the one that sets the spark. The place of the Jew in the Muslim world is very different to the place of the Jew in the Christian world. But certainly with the Muslim world, the notion is that the Jew is required to be a weak and supplicant presence. The Jew or the Jews have a legitimate place in Islamic civilization, but the legitimate place is an extremely modest and humble one in which the Jews are politically and legally, or politically powerless, militarily powerless, and legally discriminated against. This is the appropriate place in the Muslim eyes for where the Jew needs to be. So if the Jew then creates him and herself as a sovereign force, that is a matter of huge disaster from an Islamic point of view, and there is a subsequent desire to rub that out and to destroy it as quickly as possible. I think what we're witnessing today is that desire meeting up with the nascent, quite wide, latent anti-Jewish sentiment and feeling, which is deeply embedded also in the West. And the two meet and they create a very potent and powerful political presence, which produces, yes, the mood and climate very visible today in many parts, in Western capitals and parts of Western media, and so on and so forth. And as a result of that, in my own estimation, you end up with situations of quite astonishing dissonance in which one might lose one's bearings unless one had a very clear sense of what's going on. For example, you look at the Israeli military campaign underway in Gaza, which by all available metrics, by all available estimates, is taking place entirely within the norms of practice of Western militaries. If you compare it to the US-led coalition's action, for example, as recently as in Mosul City against Islamic State in 2016-2017, which I personally covered as a reporter, you find that if you look at the ratio of military to civilian dead in the Israeli case and in the coalition case, the Israelis are ahead. They are killing fewer civilians for every fighter they killed than the US-led coalition did against Islamic State. And nevertheless, the Israeli military effort is being vilified as though it was some astonishing, unique, cosmic crime against humanity, whilst the coalition's effort against Islamic State was largely applauded, pretty much by more or less everybody, except for the fairly small section of people who are active supporters of the genocidal Islamic State. Those people existed too, but everyone apart from them, pretty much. When I say everyone, I mean everyone from the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps of Iran, across to the right wing of the Republican Party in America, and more or less including everybody else in between, were very much happy about the destruction of ISIS. But when it comes to the destruction of the jihadi organization in Gaza, utilizing a more coherent and more effective and more humane military methods than were used against ISIS, that is then projected as a sort of cosmic crime against humanity. The only explanation for that, I think, can be found in the unique place of the Jew, both in Islamic and indeed in parts of Western political consciousness.
Jonathan, it boggles the mind. It boggles the mind, and it feels like we are just on a repeat of history.
Right. Yeah.
Now, one step further in the Gaza history, we get to the first peace agreement between Israel and an Arab state, Israel and Egypt.
Yes.
And Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, but not Gaza. Why?
Well, first of all, the Egyptians didn't want it. But second of all, I think that it's worth remembering that Prime Minister Menachem Begin himself would not have been in favor of giving them Gaza Strip because he regarded the Gaza Strip as part of the land of Israel. Begin was from a very, sort of tough nationalist origin, and he was willing to give up Sinai because he did not regard Sinai as historically part of the land of Israel. He had a different view towards Gaza, but also the Egyptians didn't want it. The Egyptians wanted at that stage that the Palestinian Liberation Organization should be the spokesman, so to speak, or representative of the Palestinian people. But I think more practically, the Egyptians didn't want that particular hot potato landing in their lap. And by the way, the Egyptians today, the current Egyptian successor regime, by the way, to the regime then of President Anwar Sadat, today the regime of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, also doesn't want and is tremendously reluctant to poke, to sort of dip a toe, so to speak, into the poisoned waters of administration of, or even presence in the Gaza Strip.
Indeed. Jonathan, thank you very much. This leaves us off right before the Oslo Accords and the birth of Hamas, or rather the radicalization of Hamas. Like I said, complex, tangled, thousands of years of history. And we'll continue this in the next session. Context matters. History matters. We live in a society where truth is relative and fluid, and where facts are established on social media just to be re-established the next moment, and where one of the chief sources of information is considered to be TikTok. In this society, context and history matters more than ever. No, October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. And what you heard here today, that's the context. That's the history. Let's make it count. Let's make it heard.